Hello and welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid Exam Skills, and today we're going to look at the 10-mark source questions that can be found on both period study parts of the exams. So as always with these, before we begin, a bit of a disclaimer. What I'm going to put forward in this video is not the only way to do these sort of exam questions. These are just techniques and methods I've found to be useful in the past. There are other ways to do this. This is not officially sanctioned by the exam board as the way you must do it, but like I said, these have been relatively successful for previous candidates. Again, if your teacher tells you to do it in a different way, don't argue with them. They do know what they're doing. Always listen to your own teacher instead of some random nutter on the internet. So as we've said, we're looking at the 10-mark source question that appears on the period study papers. These are the compulsory bits that you have to do, there's no way around them, and they are the first section of both the Greece and Persia paper and the Rome and their neighbours paper. So if you look on the screen, there's an example of, well, this is the specimen paper from OCR. You can see it is question 3, using the details of passage A and your own knowledge, blah 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 blah. Realistically, this is the first major question you'll have to do on the exam paper. It does require reading the source, it does require using your own knowledge, but realistically it's not that big a mountain to climb, and we'll carry on and look in a bit more detail. But this is where to find them. They're pretty obvious, you can't avoid them, they're on both papers. And before we start looking in a bit more detail at some examples and how to go about these, we should look at what does this exam question actually want, but equally important, what it doesn't want, because one thing with the GCSE papers, you are up against it with time. So don't spend time doing things that you don't necessarily need. And there is a reason why you're looking at this broken Greek vase. So the question is for 10 marks. And what it's asking you to do for 10 marks is actually not an awful lot. Ultimately, it wants you to read the source, and can you pick out the key features from that source, what it's trying to put on. Basically, do you understand what's going on? That's 5 marks. The other 5 marks then come from supplementing what you know around that source. So you cannot just use the source material. This is where this Greek vase comes in. Using any ancient source, any ancient text, is ultimately going to be like working with this Greek vase. No source is going to tell you everything you need to know. So imagine the source then is the actual shards of the vase that are there. There are bits of information, but it's not the whole picture. The bits that have been filled in this vase, the restoration work, then that counts as your own knowledge. You are filling the gaps. So you read the source, pick out the key aspects, then you use your own knowledge to kind of glue the pieces together, fill in what else do you know about the person or the event or the issue being highlighted in the source. This is a really straightforward way of approaching ancient sources and realizing and making sure you point out that no source will ever tell you everything you need to know. So effectively, you've got the bits in the source, you're filling in the gaps. Now, typically this kind of question as well will refer to what they call the nature of. This is quite a good thing to have on an exam question. Obviously, I can't say for certain whether OCR are always going to have the nature of, but this has been the kind of common stem. If it's asking you about the nature of, it's simply asking you to elaborate what do you know about this person, event or instance. In the 2 questions we're going to look at from the sample papers, the nature of very much relates to individual rulers. So using the source, what can you tell about person X? What else do you know about person X? It's really not asking you to do anything terribly tricky. There's no evaluation, there's no causation or interpretation needed. Simply it's a case of, here's a source, what do you know about this person from the source, what else do you know from your own knowledge. So for 10 marks, it's actually quite a nice question. The other thing as well, given the question is the nature of, and it's simply asking you to match the unseen source to your knowledge, you don't need a fancy introduction. There is no need for that. You don't need a conclusion. It's not asking you to make a judgment. It simply wants you to pick out things from the source and fill the gaps with your own knowledge. And given that you've got to spend less time answering this question than this video lasts, if you don't need it, don't include it. Just get straight down to business and save the hard thinking for the questions that come later on. And now let's have a look at an example. So this example is from the Specimen Greece and Persia paper, easily available on OCR's website. There's also company materials to go with this. So rather than making a question up, it seems common sense to use this question. So when you see this question, there are a few tips before you get started that will actually save minutes, shave some time, and get you ready to answer the question as well as you possibly can. First tip may sound contrary to what other subjects will tell you, but realistically with the time, I would always suggest read the question first. The temptation is obviously to read the source because it's above the question, but read the question first. The reason for this is it will guide you to what you're actually looking for. You could quite easily read the source and work out that, yeah, we're talking about Darius in this question. It's about his potential plans for invasion. But if you read the question first, it will help guide you as to what you're looking for. Again, when you're doing the actual exam, it might be useful to underline certain aspects of the passage, highlight aspects of the passage, because if they're giving you source material to use, you may as well quote it. Don't try and reinvent the wheel or rewrite history. It's there for you to use. And again, using direct reference to the passage will push your AO3 use of source marks. There's another little tip which keeps cropping up, and this is actually a good example of how the exam board are actually trying to help you. There are limits to the size of the passage that they will include. Obviously for an exam under time pressure, they're not going to give you a massive chunk of text. As with this example, because they're trying to squeeze quite a lot into a small amount of space, you may see an ellipsis. Now the ellipsis is your friend. The ellipsis simply means that the exam board have decided to chop out some text from the original source, chop out something that they see is kind of not terribly relevant, but in order to include a final point after the ellipsis. So if you're struggling and you see an ellipsis, look for what comes after the ellipsis, because ultimately, in this case, those two lines have been included for a reason. So if you see an ellipsis, look for that. And now if we look on in a little more detail about what the question is and what it's asking you to do, and again, apologies for the terrible highlighting. I hate highlighting on a computer, it's just not for me. So the question is, ultimately, what can we learn about the nature of Darius as a ruler? There are plenty of things in here that you can use. So some of the highlighted bits, I've started by highlighting the fact that this conversation takes place between Darius and Atossa. They're in bed, standard for Herodotus. And she's basically giving him a hard time about not doing what she thinks a Persian leader should do. So this idea of expanding the empire. And then she goes on to say, look, you've got vast material and resources. You're the king of the world's first superpower, and you seem happy to sit there and do nothing. Get off your backside, go and invade someone. Obviously, in the large context, she's suggesting go and invade Greece. She then throws in this extra little barb, saying that you will wear down the strength and keep them too busy to conspire against you. She's clearly now talking about Persian nobles. That tells us something about Darius. And then, after this little bit, we see Darius's final response with basically, shut up woman, I'm going to invade the Scythians. I have a plan, I've just not done it yet. So this is what I've taken from this little extract, this will form the basis of my use of, or how I would use this source to answer the question about the nature of Darius. And of course, once you've gone through the source, you've had a little read, you've done your highlighting, you've picked out what you think are the key bits, then we've got to get down to brass tacks and deal with how you're actually going to do this. How are you going to write this? And I find the easiest way to prepare for this, you may not have time to do it in the actual exam, but certainly any practice questions, is to do this really quite simple plan. It is not hard, it could not be simpler. You get 5 marks for AO3 using the source, that's one box. You get 5 marks for using your own knowledge, AO1, that's another box. Realistically, you're looking at 1 paragraph for the source and 1 paragraph for your own knowledge. That's an easy way to approach it. Try and aim for 3 points per paragraph, but use this little plan to simply lay it out so you know this is the source, this is what I'm going to do for my own knowledge. Don't forget as well, you only have 10 minutes to do this, so you've got to be quite quick about it. Now, there are 2 versions of this plan on the screen, and this just highlights that there is no set way to do these questions. Realistically, it will depend on the individual question and what it's asking you. So the first plan that's on there is kind of a vertical model. Start with the source, this is what the source tells me, blah 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 blah, here's my own knowledge, this is what else I know, blah 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 blah. That will work fine if you think that the source covers that aspect of the question quite well, and then you can just add on your next paragraph for your own knowledge. The one below, the horizontal model with the 2 boxes next to each other, this really is the example of it will depend on the question. This plan is something I literally just decided upon doing in the process of making this video. The difference with this plan is the source is next to the knowledge, so you may read the source, as in this one, and think, right, well, I actually have some knowledge that I can add on to that point about the source, which makes that clearer. So you don't have to do all of the source, all of your own knowledge. This second plan would be better if you think the answer would be best answered by expanding on points made from the source with your own knowledge. And we'll look at what that looks like just now. And for this plan, I've stuck with a straightforward source on top, knowledge on the bottom plan. And you can see I've just bullet pointed the key things I would write about in this exam question. So the first thing is that he's clearly influenced by those close to him, particularly in this case, a tosser. We can talk about the nature of his rule, and he's a man of vast power, but seems indolent. Now I've added on here that maybe that suggests he's pragmatic or cautious, and this is something I'll expand with my own knowledge. Other things I've picked out, his need to maintain his position, this idea of wear down the Persians who might be challenging him, and establish this idea of being ruled by a real man. I mean, certainly a tosser's cutting in with the barbs there. And the last point I've taken from the source is that Darius is clearly quite ambitious. He has his eyes set on Scythia, which is no slight undertaking. So there's 4 points I've picked out from the source. You don't necessarily have to write about all 4. 3 would get you by, that's fine, but you need some good coverage of the source. Underneath then, I've put my own knowledge and what I would bring to this source to help explain the nature of Darius as a ruler. So the first thing I point out, using my knowledge, is who is a tosser, this context of who she is. Certainly when you've covered all of the Persians, you'll find out that a tosser is actually a significantly powerful and individual character. The fact that she's the daughter of Cyrus is also really important, given that Darius comes to power not by necessarily legitimate means, and he uses a tosser as a way to legitimise his rule. The next thing I've put on would tie in nicely with that second source point about him being pragmatic and cautious. One thing that's not mentioned in the source is the fact that Darius is very keen on the organisation of the empire. He inherits this, well, he takes this vast superpower that seemingly is in a bit of chaos. Now that's just not down to the craziness that happened before he became king. You can also suggest this is partly because of the focus of the previous two kings. So you own knowledge, say, look, maybe he is a bit slow at invading places, but he's been busy. So we can put in that he's divided the empire into satraps. He's built the royal road, he's built the Nile Canal, he's built new palaces at Susa and Persepolis. It seems that when Darius first comes to power, the first thing he wants to do is organise what he's inherited, rather than just heading off into the sunset and invading Scythia. Following on from that, you can pick up on that wear them down part of the source. Another thing that's key to the nature of Darius's rule is that he is effectively a bit of a usurper. He's come to power through a coup, and clearly we know that he's very aware that not everyone is keen on this idea. This wearing people down suggests that maybe there are other Persian nobles or people within his empire who want to get rid of Darius. So Darius needs to make sure he is secure before he leaves Persia and goes to invade somewhere. Use your own knowledge, you can talk about one of the first things that happens when he comes to power is the revolt of the 9 kings and how Darius quite brutally crushes them. And we can reference here the Behistun inscription where he carves his message into the side of a mountain, letting everyone know that he is the king. The other thing we can put on is that he understands the need to secure a great victory in the eyes of his people. He's not a fool. He knows what the Persians expect. This is very much the legacy of particularly Cyrus, who conquered pretty much everything in sight. And even Cambyses managed to successfully invade Egypt, and he was mental. So one thing Persian kings definitely seem to do is that they conquer, and Darius knows this. So he's quite an astute figure, and this is going to figure heavily in the nature of his rule, but only when he is ready. And finally, if you are finding yourself with a bit of extra time to stick in, or you've not got one of the other points, or you just want to include it because it's useful. One thing that's interesting with Darius is that he seems to be the first Persian king, and this is quite key to the nature of his rule. He seems to be the first Persian king who nails his colours to a kind of state religion. He is the first king who frequently, readily and openly refers to Zoroastrianism and Ahura Mazda as the kind of state religion. This is quite a significant shift from previous kings. It's definitely something that figures heavily in the nature of Darius's rule, so it would make sense to include that somewhere in this answer. So this is the vertical plan. Sometimes some of these points from the knowledge do support the points from the source, but hopefully you can see how we've broken down key points from the source and then added the own knowledge. So now we get to a sample answer. This is a sample answer available from OCR on the website. This isn't an answer I've written. I would possibly do the answer slightly different, but that's just me. So this is a perfectly good answer. Apparently this got 10 marks out of 10, and you can see why. If you look carefully at it, I'm not going to talk about this too much, you can read it on your own. You can see there's a clear balance between using precise extracts from the source, but this is then supported with very, very specific use of own knowledge. So we talk about, there's evidence here for the Behistun inscription, we see direct quotes from the source, we get reference to the usurping of fake Smerdis, we get references to things like the Grand Staircase, the Behistun inscription. So there's a lot going on in this answer, but for 10 marks you could say it's relatively short. There's no introduction, there's no conclusion, it gets straight to the point and this candidate demonstrates everything they know. So I would pause this, have a read and look at where this balance has gone. This answer certainly started with the source and then deployed their own knowledge to develop the points. This is just one way of doing it. And we've moved on now to an example from the Rome paper. Again, you'll see similar size source. This time the question is about Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Superbus, but let's face it, everyone calls him Superbus because it's better. And again, the question's almost exactly the same. What can we learn about the nature of his rule? Luckily for us, everyone knows Superbus is a complete nutter. He's the panto villain of the Roman kings, and as soon as you see his name, hopefully you'll see in the source, oh look, there it is. It's all the list of things he did that was bad. So this gives us some really clear points to pick out from the source, which again have been highlighted with a shocking lack of skill on my part. So we talk about the key aspects of him coming to power, the nature of his rule. These will form nice quotes and the basis for what we'll go on to answer. So just take a minute, have a look at the source, have a look at the highlights, see if you say the same things. So back onto our simple two-box plan. Here I've just done the AO3 part, the bit from the source. So the first thing is the fact that he gets the name Superbus. It's not his birth name. This means arrogant and proud. So he's earned himself a nickname. And this straight along leads on to him talking about refusing to bury Servius. If you can see on the plan, I've just put on there that I'm going to use my own knowledge to develop that, because I think that's something that I can deploy knowledge to explain properly and give some clarity to. The second point I've added onto here is this idea of him ruling like a tyrant. The nature of his rule, very much like a tyrant. Tyrant is a great word to use in this paper, because certainly by the time you get to the kind of early Republic stuff, they are obsessed with this idea of tyranny. So use the language they use. And the source is dead straightforward. It's on the nose that he acts like a modern day dictator. He murders leading senators and those who oppose him. He surrounds himself with armed guards. This sounds like any modern day despot. So straight away we can say nature of his rule, tyrannical, not kind, clinging to power by force. Which leads us nicely onto the next point, is that he's not ruling with the will of the people. How much you could question whether a monarch rules with the will of the people is a different matter, but certainly with the Roman kings we can see Superbus is ruling almost entirely against the people. And you can see again, I'd use some of my own knowledge here. I talk about the end of the interregnum, this system of choosing kings. Again, he comes to power by force. We see him as the example of corruption of the monarchy, the end result of all this corruption, and certainly that's a key figure of his rule. So they're the bits I take from the source. And of course, once you've done the source, you need to throw in your own knowledge. I've added quite a bit more here than I would normally in a plan, but again, the whole purpose of this is to show you how to do it. So the first point I've used the side-by-side plan here, just to show you the two different versions. So the first point on the knowledge side is again developing what's there in the source, this idea that he wouldn't bury the previous king, Servius, and you just, really obvious point here, you put in your own knowledge that, well actually, it's not that he didn't want to bury him because Romulus was never buried, it's more likely that there was nothing left of him to bury. Don't forget, Servius is killed by Superbus and his body is dragged around Rome till there's nothing left of it. There you go, there's your own knowledge explaining that point. The next bit we can see is developing these points about him ruling without the will of the people. Superbus is the panto villain of the kings of Rome. He's the example of everything that's wrong with the kings. This growth of tyranny from the corruption, which arguably, use your own knowledge, starts with Tarquinius Priscus sneaking his way to the throne by less than legitimate means. We can even throw in extra bits of knowledge, like Servius, the previous king, wanted to disband the monarchy because it was seen as becoming outdated, bit corrupt. It was too much for one man to handle. Superbus, though, is not having that. He's ruling because he wants to be king, not because the king is the best way to rule. So they're 2 points that have developed what's from the source. Underneath that, though, I've got 2 extra points which are completely separate to the source. So don't forget, you don't just have to develop what's there. If you think there's something missing, stick that in. And with Superbus, the obvious points to mention are, well, some of the things he did end up being quite good. He wasn't all bad. So one thing you can always use for him is this idea of economic growth. So he built the Cloaca Maxima, which was a good thing. He built the Temple of Jupiter, which apparently ended unemployment. Alright, the Romans didn't like it, but it's something else he did that's not in the source, and that helps understand the nature of his rule. Yes, he's a bad guy, but he also does things to grow Rome. And last but not least, just as a little point on the end, again, you wouldn't necessarily have to include all of this. Another thing that defines the nature of his rule is his really poor foreign policy, particularly the fact that he starts a bunch of wars that he cannot win. So this again feeds into the nature of his rule. These are the bits of plaster of Paris that you're using to stick your vase fragments together. And again, back to another sample answer, again from the OCR website. We've got 3 nice, to the point paragraphs that again pick out extracts from the text, use the source, the AO3 part, and then develop it with their own knowledge. There are lots of different ways to approach this. Again, this is not my answer, this is one that was on the website, but hopefully you'll be able to see the kind of the key thing of including source and your own knowledge simply to describe or portray or to show how these kings or this individual is portrayed. So again, the first couple of paragraphs you see use from the source and development. The final paragraph on here covers exactly what we talked about, these other things that aren't in the source, the development of Rome, the Cloaca Maxima is in there. It says the Circus Maximus, really that's not necessarily Superbus. It's probably why this answer got 9 out of 10 instead of 10 out of 10. But it covers some of the key things. It's filling the gaps with its own knowledge. And again, for 10 marks, relatively quick, to the point, get in, get it done, move on. So finally then, quick summary, top tips to answer a 10-mark question. Tip 1, read the question first. It will guide your evaluation of the source. It will guide what you're looking for. You don't have time to be reading the source twice because you're up against it. If you can, try and aim for 3 points from the source. If you can get more, brilliant, but try and aim for 3. The mark schemes talk about full coverage of the source. 3 is a good number in an exam under time conditions. Look for the ellipsis, look for something after it. You know, that's a quick and easy way to navigate these sources. Once you've found your 3 points from the source, do remember to use them, quote them if you can, but then you should develop these with your own knowledge. Again, try and aim for 3 points. What can you add to the understanding of this person, event or issue that's not in the source? How can you fill in the gaps in that vase? When it comes to actually writing, remember, no introduction, no conclusion, just not needed. Make your points, give your specific detail, move on, because you've got much bigger questions and a whole extra section of an exam paper to do after this. So 10-mark questions. The mark allocation can seem daunting, but realistically, once you remember these little tips, they're actually not too terrible to answer. So there you have it, our quick guide to answering a 10-mark source question on the period study. I hope this has been useful, not too confusing and also not too tedious. As always, leave us a comment below, and until next time, goodbye.